All right, so you guys sent in some really interesting stuff about learning Spanish from this podcast called Language Lounge, hosted by John and Emma.
Yeah.
And they both like learned Spanish themselves, so they're kind of sharing like what they did, what worked, what didn't work.
Yeah, they really emphasize, like, right out the gate,
Yeah.
um, finding your why. Why are you learning Spanish?
Yeah.
And thinking about, like, over 500 million people speak Spanish worldwide.
Yeah.
So what possibilities could that open up for you, whether that's travel or work or even just like family and friends?
Right.
So have you thought about what your why is?
Yeah, and they even talk about how their own goals like evolved as they were learning Spanish. Like Emma was going to go on a trip, and it kind of turned into like a full-blown passion for the language itself.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how it morphed into something more.
For sure. And they also talk about some of their favorite resources, which I know could be a real jungle if you're first starting out. One that they recommend is Duolingo. Have you ever used that one?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I haven't used it.
Okay, so it's really popular, especially for beginners, because it uses gamification, like points and rewards and, even like a little competition to keep it fun.
Oh, so it's like tricking your brain into learning.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then if you want to get into like the real nitty-gritty grammar, they recommend the book Practice Makes Perfect, Complete Spanish Grammar, which is known for having really clear explanations. And it covers like everything from verb conjugations to sentence structure.
So that's like your grammar Bible then.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about like listening? I feel like for me, that's like a big goal, being able to understand people when they're speaking.
Well, you're in luck because they're big fans of the Coffee Break Spanish podcast.
Okay. Another podcast.
Another podcast, yeah. It's designed for busy people. So like short lessons you can kind of squeeze into your day, whether you're commuting or just taking a break.
Yeah.
And what's really cool is it focuses on like natural conversations. So you're picking up on like real world usage, not just textbook phrases.
That's smart. Yeah. And I know they also recommend Spanish Dict for like vocabulary and stuff.
Yeah, like a digital dictionary on steroids.
Have you used that one?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
It's great.
And then they say for remembering all these words, which I think is another like huge hurdle, they suggest Anki, which uses spaced repetition.
Yeah, so spaced repetition is based on like the science of how our brains learn and remember things. So basically it shows you words like right when you're about to forget them, which makes it way more effective than just like traditional flashcards.
Have you ever used that?
I have. It's really cool.
Okay, so we've got our apps, we've got our books, we've got our websites, but I feel like learning a language is about more than just memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about actually using it.
Exactly. And that's where immersion comes in.
Yeah.
And they have some really creative ideas for how to do that, even if you can't like hop on a plane to Spain right now.
Yeah.
Like something as simple as like changing your phone's language to Spanish
Oh, that's a good idea.
can make a big difference.
Yeah.
You think about how many times a day you look at your phone.
Yeah.
That's a lot of passive exposure to the language.
Yeah. They also talk about watching TV shows. Have you seen La Casa de Papel?
I have not.
Okay, they recommend that one.
Oh, cool.
Because they say it's good for learners because the characters speak clearly and the plot is really engaging, so it's fun to watch.
Yeah, and the storyline's so captivating, you almost forget that you're learning.
Yeah.
And they also suggest listening to Latin music, which is a great way to kind of tune your ear to the rhythm and sounds of the language. Even if you don't understand all the words, what kind of music do you normally listen to?
Oh, gosh. All kinds.
Maybe there's like a Latin artist or genre that you could explore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this one might sound kind of strange, but they even suggest talking to yourself in Spanish.
I love that one. I think that's brilliant.
What do you think about that?
It might feel silly at first, but it's a great way to practice speaking without any pressure. Like you could just get comfortable forming sentences, experimenting with different vocabulary and grammar.
Yeah.
The key is just have fun with it. Don't worry about making mistakes.
It's like giving your inner monologue a Spanish makeover.
Exactly.
And if you want to practice reading, they recommend reading Spanish news websites like El País. What's great about news articles is that they tend to use like clear and concise language, which can be helpful for learners.
Right, and you can choose articles that are on topics that interest you,
Yeah.
which makes it more engaging.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the part that I think often makes people a little nervous.
Yeah.
Which is speaking practice. It's one thing to understand Spanish, but actually speaking, it can feel like a whole different ballgame.
Oh, for sure.
So John and Emma really stress the importance of starting small and not being afraid to make mistakes. They suggest practicing basic phrases like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Or, me llamo your name. It's about building your confidence and getting comfortable with like the sounds of the language.
Do you remember what it was like when you first started speaking Spanish?
Oh, yeah. It brings back memories for sure.
Were there any like phrases or situations that you found particularly helpful or challenging?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest hurdles for me was overcoming the fear of sounding silly or
Oh.
making mistakes. Um, but I found that the more I practiced, the more comfortable I became. One thing that really helped me was finding a language partner to practice with. Have you ever considered doing that?
I haven't, but that's a good idea.
There are actually apps like HelloTalk and Tandem that connect you with native Spanish speakers who are learning your language.
Oh, wow. So you can kind of help each other.
Exactly.
That's a great idea. John and Emma also talk about the power of repetition in shadowing, which is basically like mimicking a native speaker's speech. It's like training your ear and tongue to work together to produce those Spanish sounds.
Repetition is key in language learning. The more you hear and repeat certain sounds and phrases, the more natural they become. And shadowing is fantastic for improving your pronunciation and rhythm. It's like having a personal pronunciation coach right in your ear.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried shadowing before?
I've dabbled in it, but I haven't really made it a consistent practice.
Okay.
All right, so we've covered like resources, immersion techniques, we're even starting to speak,
Mhm.
but there's one more big piece of the puzzle, grammar,
Right.
which I think can be intimidating.
It's true that Spanish grammar can seem overwhelming at first, but they offer some really helpful advice for approaching it in a way that feels manageable. So instead of trying to learn everything at once, they suggest taking a step-by-step approach, starting with like present tense verb conjugations and basic sentence structure.
Okay, so build a solid foundation
Okay,
and
amazing.
add on from there.
And what I think is really interesting is they don't just tell you to memorize rules. They emphasize the importance of like active learning, practicing through writing, even journaling in Spanish.
Yeah.
Have you found that writing helps solidify your understanding of grammar?
I do take notes sometimes when I'm learning something new, but I haven't really tried journaling.
Yeah.
You, as the expert, often talk about like recognizing patterns in Spanish grammar. Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. So Spanish, like many languages, has its own internal logic. For example, once you understand the pattern for conjugating regular verbs in the present tense, you can apply that same pattern to hundreds of other verbs.
Hmm.
It's like unlocking a secret code. And it's so much more satisfying than just like memorizing endless lists of conjugation.
Yeah, it makes more like a puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So do you find that recognizing patterns helps you learn and remember things more easily?
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered a ton of helpful tips and strategies. We've got our goals, we've got our resources, our immersion techniques, even our grammar game plan. But let's be real for a second. Learning a language takes time and effort.
Yeah.
How do we stay motivated and avoid burning out?
That's such an important question. And it leads us perfectly into the next crucial aspect that John and Emma emphasize,
Yeah.
which is consistency. And we'll get into that after a quick break. You know, as we were talking about consistency, I was reminded of something that John and Emma said about those inevitable moments of frustration. Like everybody hits a wall sometimes when learning something new. Have you ever felt that way?
Oh, absolutely. I've definitely had those moments where I'm like, not making any progress, or I'm just too busy to keep up with my studies, and it can be really discouraging.
They have some great advice for those moments. First, be kind to yourself. It's so easy to get caught up in like comparing ourselves to others. But everybody learns at their own pace. Some people might pick up languages more quickly, but that doesn't mean you're not capable of reaching your goals.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Yeah. They also talk about the power of community, like finding other people who are learning Spanish can provide so much support and motivation. Have you ever joined a language exchange group or an online forum?
I haven't yet, but I can see how helpful that would be. It's like having a built-in cheer squad for your language learning.
Exactly. Yeah, sharing your experiences, struggles, and successes with others can make a huge difference. Now, something else they emphasized that I found really fascinating is the cultural aspect of language learning. You know, they really encourage learners to think of language as more than just words and grammar, but like a window into a whole new culture.
Yeah, that's what I love about learning new languages. It's not just about being able to communicate, but understanding a different way of life, a different way of seeing the world.
And they recommend things like watching Spanish films, listening to traditional music, even trying out authentic recipes. What stands out to you about Spanish culture? Is there anything you're particularly interested in exploring?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so much to discover. I've always been fascinated by flamenco dancing. And of course, the food is incredible. I think I'd start there. Maybe try making paella or tapas at home while listening to some flamenco music.
That's a fantastic idea. And if you ever get the chance to travel to a Spanish-speaking country, that's the ultimate immersion experience.
Yeah.
But even without traveling, there's so many ways to kind of bring the Spanish culture into your everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we talked about community culture. Now, there's something else I wanted to ask you about that they touched upon, accents. I think a lot of language learners worry about that.
Right, it's a common concern. Some people embrace their accent as part of their identity, while others strive to sound as close to a native speaker as possible. What are your thoughts on that?
I think for me, I'd want to be understandable, of course, but I wouldn't be too worried about having a perfect accent. It's part of what makes me me.
That's a great perspective.
Yeah.
And they agree that there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to accents. It's a personal preference. But for those who do want to work on their pronunciation, they recommend paying close attention to how native speakers pronounce words, listening for those subtle nuances. They also suggest recording yourself and comparing it to a native speaker, which can be really eye-opening.
And they emphasize that reducing your accent is a gradual process. It takes time and patience.
Absolutely. It's like training your ear and tongue to work in a new way.
Yeah.
They also talked about the emotional side of language learning,
Yeah.
which I think is so important. It can be a real roller coaster
Yeah.
with moments of excitement and moments of frustration. Have you experienced that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've had days where I feel like I'm making so much progress and then other days where I feel completely stuck.
Yeah.
It's definitely an emotional journey.
Yeah. And they encourage learners to practice self-compassion
Yeah.
and not beat themselves up over mistakes.
Yeah.
Mistakes are inevitable and actually a sign that you're learning
Yeah.
and pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
They also talk about celebrating those little wins, those moments of success, no matter how small, like finally understanding a grammar concept that's been tripping you up, or being able to have a short conversation with a native speaker without feeling completely lost. Those moments can really boost your motivation and keep you going. Speaking of keeping you going, let's talk a little bit about study habits. John and Emma had some really practical tips on how to make your study time more effective. What kind of study environment do you usually prefer?
I definitely need a quiet space where I can focus without distractions. Sometimes I work at my desk at home, but other times I like to go to a coffee shop or a library for a change of scenery.
That's great. And they emphasize the importance of creating a dedicated study space, whether it's at home, in a library, even outdoors if the weather's nice, and removing anything that might distract you, your phone, social media, even a tempting TV.
Yeah, it's so easy to get sidetracked these days.
Well, yeah. They also recommend breaking down your study sessions into smaller, more manageable chunks. So instead of trying to cram in like 2 hours of studying on a Sunday afternoon, try dedicating 20-30 minutes each day to a specific task, like learning new vocabulary, practicing verb conjugations, or listening to a Spanish podcast. What do you think about that approach?
I actually really like that idea. It feels less daunting than trying to block out these huge chunks of time.
Right.
I could definitely find 20-30 minutes each day,
Yeah,
even if it's just during my lunch break or before bed.
exactly. It's about making it a sustainable habit that fits into your life. And they stress the importance of actively engaging with the material, rather than just passively reading or listening. Have you ever tried things like taking notes, summarizing what you've learned, or even teaching it to someone else?
I do take notes sometimes, but I haven't tried teaching it to someone else.
Okay, that's a great way to really make sure you understand it.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about a challenge that a lot of language learners face. Comprehension. It can be frustrating to listen to native speakers and feel like you're only catching every other word. Have you ever felt that way?
All the time. Especially when I'm watching movies or listening to podcasts.
Okay.
It can be discouraging to feel like I'm not understanding as much as I'd like to.
They have some really helpful tips for that. First, they suggest starting with material that's slightly below your current level. This way, you'll be able to understand the majority of what you're hearing, which can build your confidence and keep you motivated to keep listening. As you progress, you can gradually increase the difficulty level.
That's a good point. I think sometimes I get too ambitious and try to jump into content that's too advanced for me, and it just ends up being frustrating.
Right. It's all about finding that sweet spot, challenging yourself without overwhelming yourself. They also recommend focusing on the overall meaning, rather than getting hung up on every single word. You don't need to understand every single word to get the gist of a conversation or a story.
That's a good reminder. Sometimes I get so fixated on understanding every single word that I miss the bigger picture.
And they emphasize that patience is key. Improving your listening comprehension takes time and consistent effort. The more you listen to authentic Spanish content, the better you'll become at understanding different accents, speeds, and styles of speaking. What kind of content do you enjoy listening to?
Um, I like listening to podcasts, especially those that tell stories or interview interesting people. I also like watching movies and TV shows, although I usually need subtitles at this point.
That's great. There's so much great content out there to choose from. And John and Emma actually had some more specific resource recommendations that we didn't get to in part one. They're big fans of using technology to enhance the language learning experience. Have you ever tried any language learning apps like Babbel or Rosetta Stone?
I've heard of them, but I haven't tried them personally. Are those the kinds of apps you'd recommend?
They can be really helpful. They offer structured lessons, personalized feedback, and a variety of activities to practice different skills. So think of them as like supplemental tools that can reinforce what you're learning from other resources.
That makes sense.
They also recommend online dictionaries and translators, like Word Reference and Google Translate. But they caution against relying on them too heavily. It's always best to try to understand the meaning from context first,
Yeah.
and only use a translator as a last resort. What are your thoughts on using translators?
I definitely use them sometimes, especially when I encounter a word or phrase that I just can't figure out.
Right.
But I try not to rely on them too much
Right.
because I know they don't always provide the most accurate or natural translations.
Right. It's important to use them as a tool, not a crutch. They also suggest exploring YouTube channels and websites that offer Spanish lessons and tutorials. There are some really fantastic resources out there, from grammar explanations to pronunciation guides to cultural insights. What's your preferred learning style?
I think I'm a bit of a visual learner. I definitely gravitate towards videos and images when I'm learning something new.
Oh, there are so many great visual resources available online. You can find everything from animated grammar lessons to virtual tours of Spanish-speaking cities. It's about finding what works best for you and incorporating it into your learning routine. Speaking of learning routines, something that really struck me is that they emphasize there's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning. Everybody learns differently, and it's important to find what resonates with you. Some people might thrive with structured lessons and textbooks, while others might prefer a more immersive approach. What's your take on that?
I think that's so true. It's about being self-aware and tailoring your learning experience to your individual needs and preferences.
Exactly. Now, as we move towards the conclusion of this part of our deep dive, there's one final aspect I want to highlight: mindset. John and Emma stressed that having a positive and growth-oriented mindset is crucial for success as a language learner.
I can definitely see how that would be important. Language learning can be challenging, and it's easy to get discouraged if you don't believe in yourself.
They talk about the power of self-talk and reframing negative thoughts into more positive and encouraging ones. For example, instead of saying, "I'm terrible at Spanish," try saying, "I'm learning and I'm making progress every day." Small shifts in perspective can make a big difference.
That's such a good point. It's easy to get caught in a negative spiral of self-doubt, but consciously reframing those thoughts can really help shift your mindset.
And they emphasize being patient and persistent. Learning a language takes time and effort, and there will inevitably be setbacks along the way. But if you stay committed to your goals and keep practicing, you will eventually reach fluency. What helps you stay motivated when things get tough?
I think reminding myself of my why helps a lot. Why am I learning Spanish in the first place? What do I hope to achieve with it? That usually gives me the boost I need to keep going.
That's a great strategy. Yeah, as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I want to revisit the importance of setting realistic goals, something that they emphasize throughout the podcast. They remind us that language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. It's about making consistent progress over time, rather than trying to cram everything in at once.
Yeah.
They encourage learners to set small, achievable goals that they can build on gradually. For example, you might start by aiming to learn 10 new words each day, or to have a 5-minute conversation in Spanish. Have you found that setting smaller goals helps you stay on track?
Absolutely. It's much more motivating to achieve those smaller milestones and feel that sense of accomplishment along the way, rather than getting overwhelmed by one giant goal.
Exactly. And they emphasize that it's okay to adjust your goals as you go along. Your priorities and circumstances might change, and that's perfectly fine. The important thing is to keep moving forward, even if it's just one small step at a time.
Now, as we transition to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question to ponder.
Think about the various stages of language learning: beginner, intermediate, advanced. Where do you see yourself on this spectrum right now? And what are some specific steps you can take? to progress to the next level.
Ooh.
Take some time to reflect on your current skills
Yeah.
and identify areas where you'd like to improve. Are there specific grammar concepts you want to master? Do you want to expand your vocabulary in a particular area? Or do you want to focus on improving your fluency and confidence in speaking?
Yeah.
Identifying your areas of focus will help you create a targeted and effective learning plan. And we'll delve even deeper into that in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore even more insights and strategies to help you achieve your Spanish language goals.
Okay, so we've talked about like finding your why, checking out different resources, tackling grammar, and even like embracing those moments of frustration. But how do we pull all this together into an actual plan to learn Spanish?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And John and Emma really stress the importance of having like a clear roadmap for your language learning journey.
Mm-hmm.
So they suggest thinking about, where you are now and visualizing where you want to be, maybe in a few months or even a year from now. So what are those like big picture Spanish goals that you have in mind?
For me, I think being able to have a conversation with someone in Spanish would be amazing. Not perfectly, of course, but enough to get my point across and understand what they're saying.
That's a fantastic goal. And to get there, they recommend breaking that big goal down into smaller, more manageable steps. So like maybe this month you focus on mastering basic greetings and introductions. Then next month you could tackle like ordering food at a restaurant. It's like climbing a mountain. You reach the summit one step at a time.
Yeah, I like that analogy. It makes the whole process seem less overwhelming.
Right.
They also talk about keeping track of your progress, which I think is so important for staying motivated. Have you ever kept a language learning journal or used a habit tracker?
I have, and it's incredibly helpful. Seeing how far you've come, even those small wins, can be a huge motivator.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in what you haven't mastered yet. But taking the time to acknowledge your progress can really boost your confidence.
Okay, so let's be realistic. We all know there will be bumps in the road. What are some of those common challenges that language learners face? And how can we prepare for them?
One of the biggest hurdles, I think, is finding the time to study consistently,
Hmm.
especially with our busy lives. So John and Emma suggest getting creative with your time management. Instead of trying to carve out these huge chunks of time, think about incorporating Spanish into your daily routine in smaller ways. Could you listen to a Spanish podcast while you're getting ready in the morning? Or watch a Spanish show with subtitles while you're cooking dinner?
Yeah, those are good ideas. It's easy to get caught up in thinking you need like a dedicated hour-long study session every day. But even those little moments of exposure to the language can add up.
Absolutely. And another common challenge is dealing with that fear and self-doubt. It's so easy to feel intimidated when you're first starting out, especially when you compare yourself to others.
Oh, yeah. I think we all have that inner critic that tells us we're not good enough or we're not making progress fast enough.
Exactly. And they have a great tip for dealing with that. They say to reframe those negative thoughts into positive ones. So instead of saying, I'm terrible at this, try saying, I'm learning and I'm proud of myself for trying. It's about celebrating those small victories and acknowledging your efforts.
Yeah, that's so powerful. It's like shifting that inner dialogue from being critical to being encouraging.
Exactly. Now, sometimes those bumps in the road require a little extra support.
Hmm.
John and Emma also talked about the role of teachers and tutors in language learning. Have you ever considered working with a teacher?
I haven't, but I'm definitely open to it. I think especially when it comes to things like grammar and pronunciation, having someone who can provide personalized feedback would be so helpful.
Yeah, and they suggest finding a teacher who aligns with your learning style and goals. And with so many online learning platforms available these days, it's easier than ever to find qualified Spanish teachers from all over the world.
One of the things I'm most excited about is the possibility of traveling to a Spanish-speaking country someday and actually being able to communicate with people.
Oh, that's the beauty of learning a new language, right? It opens up a whole new world of possibilities. And they shared some of their own travel experiences
Yeah.
and emphasized the importance of just using your Spanish as much as possible, even if you're not fluent.
That can be scary, though. What if people don't understand me or I make a mistake?
They said that most people are incredibly patient and appreciate the effort, even if your grammar isn't perfect or your accent is a little shaky. They encourage travelers to step outside of their comfort zone, order food in Spanish, ask for directions, even just strike up conversations with locals. Those real-world interactions are where the magic happens.
Yeah, it's about embracing those moments of imperfection and using them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Absolutely, and beyond the practical benefits. They also talked about the cognitive benefits of language learning, which I found fascinating. Studies have shown that learning a new language can actually improve your memory, attention span, and even your ability to multitask. It's like giving your brain a workout.
Wow, that's amazing. And they also talked about the personal growth that comes with language learning, like increased self-confidence, cultural awareness, and even new career opportunities.
Yeah, it's an investment in yourself.
Mhm.
That pays dividends in countless ways. So as we wrap up this deep dive into learning Spanish, let's circle back to those key takeaways that John and Emma shared. They emphasize that learning a language is a journey, not a destination. It's about enjoying the process, embracing the challenges, and celebrating your progress along the way.
Right. They encouraged us to find what works best for us, whether it's using language learning apps, attending classes, immersing ourselves in the culture. And to be consistent in our efforts, they reminded us that it's okay to make mistakes and to be patient with ourselves.
And they emphasize those incredible rewards that come with learning a new language, connecting with people, expanding your horizons, and enriching your life in countless ways.
So, as we close out this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. What excites you most about learning Spanish? Is it the prospect of traveling to new destinations, connecting with people from different cultures, or simply the challenge of mastering a new skill?
Whatever your motivation may be, we encourage you to embrace the journey. Stay curious and never stop learning. The world of Spanish awaits you.
And that concludes our deep dive into learning Spanish. We hope you found this exploration insightful and inspiring. Until next time, keep those language learning fires burning.